Welcome to the Paddle Pursuit Podcast, a podcast about paddle racing, the community, equipment, and everything else we can think of. Thank you so much for joining us today, and let's get started. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Paddle Pursuit. I'm Robert Norman, your host, and we're here today. You may know him from Facebook as Theo Byrne, but you might see here that it is Ted Burnell. So I don't even know how to put your name on the description because people might only know you as Theo Byrne as opposed to Ted Burnell. So
That's true.
Theo is a staple part of the community in Chattanooga, which is right where the Chattajack is at. He has been there, I think, since the very beginning. Is that right?
Yep.
You're going to be like a quadruple buckle holder at some point. So Theo has paddled many different paddle crafts all over the place, right? Super interesting guy. We're very lucky to have him on the podcast. Theo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Sounds like a fun time.
So I don't actually know your start in paddling, the progression into paddle sports and outrigger canoes and surf skis. So can you walk us through how you got into paddling and how it's kind of evolved into where you're at today?
Sure. I was a bike racer at the time, and I was living in Vermont. And you may know Clyde Yarnell, who's a marathon canoe racer. Lived kind of down the road from me. He would put together triathlon teams that were paddle, bike, run, relay teams for these paddle triathlons that were very popular at the time. And I would bike for them. And I was kind of enamored with the boat, so I decided to get a C1 so I could do the entire thing myself, the paddle, bike, and run. And that's how I started into it. And then I got into a C2 with a good buddy of mine, and he and I started racing. We started paddling more than I was biking, but throughout most of my life, I kind of gone back and forth between paddling and biking. But in the last 10 years, it's been mostly paddling.
With the C2, when did that start to evolve into like the outrigger canoe? Did you go through SUP first? What was the progression through those different boats?
Okay, so I actually moved to Colorado from Vermont, and when I got out there, I got into kind of an offshoot of the marathon canoe. It's a downriver open canoe, very similar to a marathon canoe, just a little wider, more freeboard, so that it can go through big standing waves in the river and in the big deep holes. We would race up to Class 3 whitewater. Did that for quite a while. They have really some really long races. There's one that we did was a 55 miler one day. And that kind of racing out west, you'll race 3-4 miles on glassy flat water, and then you're going through 700 yards of big class 2 water, which is what the west is kind of known for. And then flat water again. So these boats were ideal. You could sit or kneel. Sit and switch or kneel for stability to get through the rapids. So I did that for quite a bit, and I was training in Colorado on the Boulder Reservoir, and I met an adventure racer. He was Australian. He was out there training in a Wildwater kayak, which is a closed deck version of what I was paddling, and he was training for. His name was Ian Adamson. He was training to do the 24-hour world record in kayak. I was on his pit crew for that world record attempt, which he succeeded. He did 212 miles. It was a river unlimited category, so he could go with current. And at the end, he ended up with this Futura surf ski. He traded me for an old Wildwater kayak I had bought. I ended up with a surf ski, paddling it around out there. Did some downriver in the surf ski, which was really fun because it had a kick up rudder. I moved to Tennessee with that. I was the first person in Chattanooga with a surf ski, and gradually paddling ski at different races, saw the outrigger canoes, asked some people if I could borrow them, went out and paddled outrigger, really liked it. It fit, with my single blade experience. Then ended up buying an OC1 from John Ross. Had the first OC1 in Chattanooga. I then ended up bringing OC2 up here. I got the Green Dragon, which is kind of a famous outrigger in these parts. Had the first OC2, and just the scene has kind of grown from that up here. A lot of people have outriggers.
So, highlighting some of the whitewater and the offshoots of the Wildwater. Um, so when we had Joe on the show, we took some time on like explaining like what a K1 is, because as we get into some of the popular race categories that we're part of today, some of these boats are like not seen unless you venture into the niche. So, can you do your best to explain a Wildwater boat's shape and the overall stability and its usage?
Yeah, so a Wildwater kayak or C1, there are Wildwater C1s. Wildwater kayaks and C1s are a decked over boat. They're completely decked. If you saw a C1 paddler, you would think he's in a kayak, other than the fact that he's got a single blade in his hands. He happens to be kneeling in that boat, but it's hard to see because he's got the neoprene skirt. Um, Both the K1 and the C1 in Wildwater are similar to the K1 and C1 versions that you see in sprint disciplines. They are decked over though, so they can go through heavy, rough water. They're a touch more stable, depending on the model, of course. They also have this crazy wing off the back of them, which was meant at the time to meet minimum width requirements. And the minimum width requirement wasn't related to the water line, but just somewhere on the boat. So to get those that wide part of the boat up out of the water, so it didn't interfere, cause drag, they're very high in the boat. They actually make rolling that kayak back up very difficult because they kind of act very strange in the water once they're upside down. So yeah, they're quite tippy. And the people who do it, the people who are really good at that discipline, Chris Hipgrave, Terry Smith, the Pops, and name a pop, and they're all Wildwater paddlers. They make it look easy, but it is incredibly difficult to run whitewater in one of these.
It's funny how when we look at boats that have specs versus not specs, like so no spec boats, like they come out very elegant and beautiful because you can just kind of make them from start to finish however you want. And then spec boats always have kind of a weird wing on them. That's
Yeah.
a great example. The marathon canoe, right? Nowadays, like it's got a weird wing. It looks like a Batmobile flying through the
Yep.
water. And it's kind of interesting when you have that spec, everybody works around it trying to
Yeah.
achieve, some idea. And it's kind of refreshing at times when you don't have that and you can just let a boat kind of become what it's meant to be at its full potential.
Right. And the marathon community, their rules require that wing to be at the water line,
Mhm.
to be essentially on the water. And the idea there was trying to keep a minimal stability to these boats, so you didn't have this sport that nobody could get into. There's a reason high kneel C1 is so obscure and nobody does it, whereas in the marathon there's huge marathon races, right? So that was their goal. Whereas the ACA, a different governing body, they were like, this wing needs to be really high up. My understanding is now that they have actually done away with that wing. That the rule changes just recently, and I've seen Wildwater boats that really look very streamlined, no wing. They've kind of gotten rid of that rule.
With some of the accessibility in the sport, on episode 5, we had Bailey Leist on here, who junior paddler who did the high knee sprint canoe, and I have her high knee sprint canoe now. And so we went through kind of explaining how arduous and difficult that is. Speaking of kneeling in the wild water boats, if you ever go on YouTube and watch slalom style canoe and
Yep.
kayak, they are actually kneeling on there where their heels are touching their butts, right? When
Right.
somebody told me that, it was like it because it looks like they're sitting in the boat, right? But
Yeah.
they're actually kneeling, and it's like,
Yep.
and you can't see them from the waist down, so it's kind of like a magic trick. But it shows like the mobility required to be in kind of a strained position like that
Mhm.
under heavy amounts of load. It just kind of shows how difficult it is for those athletes to do what they do.
Yeah, the
Going
kneeling gives, especially like in the slalom, the kneeling gives you stability. But with the C1 as opposed to the K1 and whitewater, you've only got to paddle on one side, so it's a more difficult skill. But because of the leverage of your height advantage, they can rip some crazy turns, that a kayaker can do as well, but he's got to be more careful, protecting the shoulder and that sort of thing. It's definitely the kneeling aspect is a challenge. Of course, in high kneel, you're only kneeling with one knee. In whitewater disciplines, they're kneeling on both knees, and then kind of sitting on a foam block that's between their legs, keeping so they're not sitting crushing down on their ankles, but they do have a foam block that are supporting their weight.
What was it like being in an area that was brand new to paddling in general and bringing some of these first ideas to the community, right? What was it like, having to explain these boats and show them to people and trying to like build a group around that?
So when I first started doing any races at all, when I moved here, I had that surf ski. I also had that C1, that open boat, ACA style open downriver C1, but there wasn't really much paddling around here to do with that other than just flat water, and it's not an ideal flat water boat, especially in the wind. So I mostly just paddled this old Futura surf ski that I had, and they all of a sudden a race popped up here in town, and I was like, great, because I had missed racing, had raced a bunch in Vermont and out in Colorado. So I went to the race. It was a 6-mile race that we used to have here in Chattanooga, and it was always early October, a couple of weeks before Chattajack, and it even started before Chattajack came along. And I would show up at that. Well, that race brought some out of towners who would bring some K1s, or there was a handful of surf skis. I don't know if you know Eric Mims. He would come to this race. Of course, those guys were like crazy fast, right? But they weren't from this area. Eric, I think, originally was from Memphis, and Terry Smith would come and paddle his Wildwater kayak, which they're very fast on flat water. They're a bit of a nightmare if it's real windy. But if you got calm conditions, they're really fast. But Terry saw how fast Eric Mims was in this surf ski and decided I need one of those. I need a steering to help out on the open lakes, and that kind of helped trigger getting a few skis in this area. And then of course Chattajack came and just blew the market wide open.
What was the start of Chattajack in its infancy, and what are some of the early year progressions that allowed it to kind of gain traction as we know it today?
So the race really started off as a paddleboard race. Ben Freeberg was paddleboarder. He'd been racing around the Southeast. I know he did, like you did. He did the 24-hour record at one time, and then he just decided we need kind of a crazy distance race in this area, something farther than I think a lot of the stuff at the time you had to drive a long ways, and it was all like 5-10 miles. So he was like, let's put on a longer race. And he invited a bunch of people he knew, mostly from Florida. Some of the real original. The first year, there was only 37 people. I did not race the very first year. I lent that Futura surf ski to my old marathon canoe racing partner who also raced kayak. He came down from New York and raced it. And he was like one of 3 surf skis in it. There were no, I think there was maybe 1 or 2 OC1s, maybe 1 OC2 at the time, but predominantly it was all paddleboard. The race at that time started over in Coolidge Park and was much more laid back and informal. It just every year grew from there. And as time went on, that shift went from paddleboard to outrigger primarily, with more and more skis showing up. But in terms of people switching craft, it was really people who were like, man, that's a long way to stand up in the wind. And they were like, I might sit down and get out of the wind a little bit. So gradually more and more outriggers started showing up. And it was paddleboarders that were switching over.
What do you think is one of the big draws of Chattajack in general, right? Well, I think we can safely say on the eastern side of the US, it's the biggest race every
Yep.
year, as far as participation and, the draw that it kind of amasses. What do you think is something that sets it apart from typical races?
I think it obviously had Ben's was really good at kind of that guerrilla marketing of the Stoke, right? There was nobody better at just getting that vibe out through a guerrilla means, without big formal advertising. And he just knew the market. He just knew the people that he was targeting, and it just kept growing because everybody did it. Was like that race was brutal, but it was really incredible. So it just kept spreading from that. And then what keeps it going? I think people love it. It's kind of a bookend to the season. Even if you have other races after Chattajack, it's late enough in the fall. It's the bookend to the race season for most of the people that are showing up to race. Um, it's a very large race, and it's kind of this fall festival feel. And I really get the sense from the Florida paddlers like you yourself. You guys come up because it's like you get to be in the mountains during the foliage. It sometimes is coinciding with peak foliage. I think this year was very close. Um, and then there's just that, hey, let's go do something hard. It's going to be cold. It's going to be windy. And that's what makes that race hard. You tell people this race is really hard, and you say 32 miles, and people are like, yeah, I've paddled that far a bunch, but it's different to race wide open for that distance with more than half of it being a strong headwind and rain, and that rain being half frozen, that kind of thing. So I think just the hardness of it, difficulty, time of year, the fact that it's this real big fall festival, things are going to get really quiet from the paddling scene for the rest of the winter.
Yeah, I agree. For our club in Florida, it ends up being kind of an annual pilgrimage, and it is definitely a tool that we use to motivate not only our new paddlers but experienced racers to. You always have this looming threat over your head where it's like, I need to get mileage in to prepare for this thing, right?
Yeah,
And if you take that away, you take away a primary motivator, right? So it's almost like preparing for like a marathon in the running
yeah,
world, right? You have this big, culmination of your skill and hard work and the traveling, and I think
yeah.
everything comes together to like a perfect storm that it's interesting. Like it just very much so encapsulates, as you said, the market as we have it now.
The other thing is, it's once it's to a certain size, once it achieved a certain size, one of the new draws to a race that big is you always have somebody around you, racing. A lot of our smaller races, like Danny Smith's race coming up on the Saturday, I think.
Mhm.
It's a great race, but you get out there and you might have somebody a half mile ahead of you and a half mile behind. You're kind of all alone, just grinding away, and that can happen in most races. Whereas Chattajack, that's pretty rare that there's nobody that isn't right alongside of you or right in front of you or right behind you. They might be in your category, they might not. Even if a completely different category and a different wave, you still have that constant action of passing, being passed, people around you. So it's a different. It's that in and of itself became a big draw. The fact that the race is so large, and it's also a trapped course. You're not. It's not like on the ocean. You're you're kind of squeezed into everybody's trying to do the same line, and that gives an intimacy to the paddling with all the people you've never known and all the people you do know in the sport.
Yeah, and that all adds to that perfect storm where it's a very ideal course because you have current that's helping you, which psychologically is a draw for a lot of people. But it's also not too much current. Like if you look at the Missouri River, 5 or 6 miles an hour can be life threatening, right? It's great for paddling if things go well. You fall out of your boat, you get
Yeah,
disattached. 6 miles an hour, that boat is flying away from you, right? So from a safety standpoint, that it's almost like too much current is bad, but not
yeah,
enough current is like too much of a slog. The You have to sign up in May, or it's May 1st, right? Is the
yeah,
sign up? Yep. And
yeah.
you sign up at midnight, and it's a big deal. And if you don't sign up right at midnight, you're on the wait list, and you're number 400, and like you don't get in. So there's so many little factors that go into making it the way that it is now. And it's cool to look at the snowball now because it's like huge, knowing that it started with just 30 paddlers in
Mhm.
just some race, and kind of building up to that point is really neat. Do you think that it could be replicated? Like, if there was another race that was very similar, would it just diminish the value of the one big one that we have currently? Or do you think that it could occur in some other time of the year or some other parameter?
I think. Well, I'll give you an example. I would call it the antithesis race to Chattajack, which was also one of the best races ever. Was the shark bite, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it was polar opposite. It was that many people, but it was a shorter course. It was sunshine versus freezing rain. It was the kickoff. Those two races bookended the entire season. So it was kickoff. It was a beach party. It was come on down from up north. It was just the opposite. Rather than pulling Florida paddlers up into the mountains, the people from the mountains are coming down horribly pale, and getting out on the beach and just getting sun. And there was a party festival. It was a fun race. It was, the distance wasn't too hard because it was springtime, and you didn't have really a chance to put in the miles to do a hard race in the spring, though. And it was a huge race as well, but it's different. So I think any race you couldn't replicate it. It just couldn't be, unless you did the exact same stretch of water with the exact same mailing list and all that. I think you can make a phenomenal race. And if it was too close to Chattajack, you might have where they siphon off each other. But you could have a phenomenal race on a different venue, but it would be a different race. It just wouldn't be the same. You couldn't recreate it.
Yeah, and I kind of agree, like, looking at it, because when we think about, like, how can we build a community, one of the things is, like, having big races, right?
Mhm.
But one of the things that makes, like, an annual festival so memorable for life is it's annual. If you had that same festival every week, it would lose its value by
Oh
the end
yeah,
of the year, right?
yeah,
And so with these races, there's almost a cap where, like, you have some of these that are going to be huge potentially,
mhm,
but there can't be too many, or all of a sudden all of them now start to kind of, lose their allure.
yeah,
Um, the shark bite, that's a great example of the antithesis can be just as successful if everything goes perfectly, right?
yeah,
Rob is somebody we're going to have on the show
yeah,
to discuss the rise and the eventual end of shark bite and what it would take potentially to try it, because that's everybody mentions that, right? They're like, man, I miss shark bite. I had Scott Cummins on here, and like the first thing he says, like, hey, I'm Scott Cummins, I'm from Kentucky, and I miss shark bite.
yeah. And that's what the two races had in common, though, is as different as Ben is from Rob. They were both, and of course Karen as well with Rob, running, like, they were just really good at putting a race on and knew how to underground guerrilla market that stoke, and they did it very differently. But they came to the end conclusion of a fantastic race. And there are small races that are fantastic, but you know it doesn't drive the sport as well as a really big one. The big races are key, and I wish there were a few more. We don't need a dozen of them, but if there were three or four, or maybe a race in a really tropical locale, middle of winter, that would be great fun as well. But or um, some kind of international destination race that was very easy to get to and very easy to get boats. Like, that's something that's sort of missing as well. I know there's a couple of them out there, but those sorts of things, I think there's some fruit out there to be had.
So over time, one of the things that Chattajack has done very well is it has understood its demographic, and it has evolved over time to meet those demands. So, like you said, a lot of those sub racers have become outrigger racers, and they are welcomed with open arms at this event. There is another race that is in North Carolina that has had the popularity rivaling Chattajack, which is the Carolina Cup. But over time, that race has started to lose a lot of its momentum. And I feel like it's because they've been trying to cater to SUP exclusively. That market is changing. Those people are no longer there, and they're no longer feeling welcome at this event anymore. So when you look at the sit down participation, it's like
Yeah,
15 boats, right?
yeah.
With races, in your opinion, identifying your market and almost placating to the people that are running the event as opposed to appeasing sponsors. How important is that in the long term in keeping a race alive?
You know, I think sponsors are important to the race. don't think they're all the end all, right? They're not paying for the majority of the bills. It's the racers. The race should be about the racers. Racers also have the responsibility to say, hey, this race director is putting on this style of race at this place with these rules. If I go, I'm agreeing to all that. You don't hound them to death about disagreeing with everything they are. And I know Carolina Cup's a classic example of they kept trying to cater to different complaints, and it made it worse and worse and worse. They would have been far better off saying, this is a race. You don't like it, if you find these conditions too tough for your boat, there's a lot of complaints about outriggers being broken on a beach launch.
Right.
Then don't do this race. The paddleboarders don't have a problem with it. So don't do this race, or do they had the short course that was all, on the intercoastal waterway. And then they're like, well, look, we'll start the longboats on the other side and they'll still race in the ocean, but that way they don't have to do a beach entry. And that's not, I stopped going because I was like, I want to do a beach entry. If I demolish my boat, that's the exciting thing, is knowing that there's that danger of punching through. I don't have you raced the Carolina Cup. It's got like a crazy, at least the year I raced it, like it was all right on the beach was where it was breaking. It was really steep that year. Tons of boats got broke. I didn't go when they said, when they said 3, 2, 1, go. I waited for the proper break in the waves, and you just, it rewarded a little patience, a little skill about what you're doing. And yeah, but I was still real worried punching through something that rough. Luckily made it through, but they shouldn't have been changing the course. When a racer signs up to do a race, they should look at all the rules, all the the comments that the race directors put in the thing about you won't be getting a refund if you cancel, past a certain date. That's just the way it is. You have agreed to that when you buy it. But the race directors need to kind of understand what racers want as well, or they won't show up at the race. So it's a give and take.
I would say too with the Carolina Cup. So when they move the boats, the long boats into the inside, all of the draw, all of the spectators, the real finish and the hoopla is on the surf side. So they start and
Right.
end, they run through this big thing.
Yep.
There's people cheering, and then if you start on the inside, there's freaking nobody there except like the person you came with to cheer you on, and there's like it's almost like it's happening in the background, and it doesn't showcase some of these athletes because they don't get
Right.
a real finish. They just kind of got to go out there and do it. When the course was 2 days, where it was sup on Saturday and long course on Sunday, and
Mhm.
all the long course racers, that was the event. It started on the inside, ended on the inside, but all the spectators were there. The first year they did that, super cool. Danny Ching, George Cronstead, uh, Travis Grant, a lot of super OC superstars. So you're out there and you're looking at them as like,
Yep.
holy crap. And it took away from the excitement of the beach, but you didn't feel like you were just like, in the closet with a blanket over you and just like, yeah, go have fun type thing, right? It was like you were the main attraction essentially, right? And I
Yep.
felt like when they did it that way, like you said, to placate, they inadvertently was like, you finish and nobody cares, right? But you can hear the first place finisher on the other side of the beach, and the world goes wild for them, and it's just like, like I'm
Yep.
not being respected for my time and effort, and my entry fee is the same, and so on, right? And it harbors some ill will for participants to not go the next year, and then it
Yep.
starts to accumulate, and it diminishes over time. Yeah, I try not to give organizers too much of a hard time, but Carolina Cup, it's one where like it's happening in real time, and we can look at it and we can take notes,
Yeah.
because if we don't understand it, it'll happen again. We'll have a big race, something, they'll placate against the community, and then it eventually goes away. It hurts the community as well. When events like
Right.
that go under, we all feel it. So back to Chattajack, evolving over time. One of the biggest evolutions has been the OC6 over time, right? So I did it in 2019, and I think there
Mhm.
was like 5 boats, and I steered that year, and even 5 was. There's a lot of us out here. And last year, I believe it was 26. And to give you perspective on that, so that's like 150 racers. In all of the kayak divisions, including surf ski, every tandem kayak, the triple kayak, there were 9 more participants with double blades than there were just the OC6s. And that doesn't count OC1, OC2, nothing, right?
Right.
So the popularity of the OC6 alone almost completely rivals kayakers in their entirety, right? So that's a huge
Mhm.
evolution. That's a lot more paddlers and participants coming from Canada, California, and I think that draw brings people in from further away. The tricky part is there's only so much daylight, there's only so much time, there's only so
Yeah.
many logistics, and this race was not started with the thought of the OC6, right? It was
Right.
thought with SUPs and OCs and some of these other smaller boats. Now you throw in all these OC6s. What were some of the big logistical hurdles from being a participant from your point of view this year in regards to the OC6s?
Um, this particular year, my goal was a good, clean, safe finish because it was Cindy's. I paddled OC2 with Cindy. Um, it was her 5-year belt buckle year. It was my double belt buckle year. So, you know, we just wanted to get down the river and safe. So we hung back. We did not try to get up and at all competitive up into the middle of the start line. Um, I was like, it won't matter to our overall goals. Um, even with that being said, um, wow, it created. I, I don't think other than from paddling to maintain directional control. I don't think I took an honest forward paddle stroke after I started from the start line till about a half a mile past the old Jotty Bridge, the last bridge you go under, because I was just getting sucked along by all the boat swell, and we were getting squeezed up between. Um, Even trying to not get up into those C6s, you just all of a sudden were, and squeezed between other boats on these big, huge boat swell wakes, and it was surfing heaven. I had so much fun. It was literally the most fun start, but it could have been not fun in a real quick moment, right? Um, I think a lot of the people that were paddling around me, I could see they were very uncomfortable on those waves because they're just they're flat water paddlers who don't do a lot of really rough water paddling, and they were having trouble keeping a boat. You know, they were trying to oversteer their boat essentially, and then they would veer very hard, and you had to predict that. It reminded me a lot of like paddling on the Wiki Wachi race where you have to predict the unpredictable of the people, the recreational boaters. It was that sort of thing. Um, but I stayed back out of it enough. We still had conflict with one OC6 that we just couldn't get around. It was going slower than we were, but he was doing crazy Ivans all the way down the river. He was last. I think he was last place OC6. I don't really know. But it obviously created a lot of problems on the water, collisions and that such. Um, Part of me is like, that's exciting. You're getting into it now, right? It wouldn't be exciting if you were injured or had your boat broken. Um, but yeah, it's at that point where it's that many OC6s jammed in, and you mentioned a good point. There's only so many hours of daylight. Adding another heat makes that race, which is already a phenomenally difficult logistical race to run. Adding another heat just adds chaos because not every OC6 is that fast either. So now you're talking boats coming in way late. The finish line has to wrap up and get cleaned up and get on out of there. And if they're going to give that last heat 8.5 hours like they're giving everybody else, they're going to run into problems getting to award ceremonies and all that. I'm not sure what the answer is. Maybe um, same heat, but completely different lineups. You're still going to have issues. And the fact of the matter is, even if you had a different heat, those OC6s are going to, if you put them behind, they're going to come flying up through at mile 4 through everybody, or at least a big majority of people. They're not going to be catching Joe Sirkovich, but they're going to be catching me, right? So in a way, I'm glad they're in that heat and not in a heat behind. So yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer to it. at this point.
Yeah, a lot of the navigation of those boats comes from like kind of understanding what it is, what it can do, and some of the dangers of what it can do, right?
Mhm.
Because it's like over 40 feet long, you know, like you mentioned, the crew's steersman skill level changes the dynamic, right? When you have very skilled steersmen, you can predict what they're going to do.
Yeah.
So on my OC2 start, I look over and it's Rob, the shark bite director, and I know and I trust that he is a good steersman. So I line up right next to him. I know I'm going to win the 50-yard dash, and that gives me an opportunity to go forward, yield, and let his boat fly by. And that is exactly what happened. But had that been an inexperienced person, I could have yielded left. There could have been something, and they just run my ass over, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes on with the skill level. And like you said, the speed inherently, right? The top crews are ridiculously fast. But some of the slower boats, and especially the spec boats in general, are much slower, and it kind of adds to the overall chaos. I don't think it's possible, but if it was, would there be a way to screen a team's skill level, the steersman's experience? Is there a way that that could be integrated, or is that background check just not
That,
really feasible?
that's a horrible slippery slope. And yeah, I mean, how do you really evaluate it unless you've raced with that kind of person? I think, you know, this is still you're having a race where there is no OC6 team in Chattanooga. You don't have any real experience with these craft, and you know what it'll take to manage them, other than from a logistics of getting them on the water, on and off the water. But you know, managing them into that massive mix of other smaller boats, it's a really difficult thing. Um, Putting them in the first wave so they could kind of punch away and get away from everybody, maybe. But you know, now you've got I can't a fat you know, a lot of the stand up paddlers struggle with the race start at Chattajack because it gets tumultuous quick, and if you were standing up and you're kind of moderate experience, that could be a challenge to just try to be upright when all those OC6s start creating wakes like crazy. Yeah, I think there'll always be issues, right? You put that many OC6s out there. Um, you know, I have no answer for it at all. I know it's being looked at heavily about how to mitigate that many boats. Certainly want them to come. We want the paddlers here for sure. But yeah, it's only the river seems pretty wide until you have that many boats on it, and that's the other thing with Chattajack. You know, I've heard people saying, "Well, the river's super wide. They could go down the right side and you could go down the left." The reality is the lines, the actual fast lines in the river are not that wide. There's a lot of shallow water on the sides, and racers sense that very quickly. Um, so they're all trying to get to that same spot, that same direct line to that next bend. You know, it's where every boat wants to be. If you do some aerial, if you look at some of the aerial photos, Chattajack, it's a line of boats going down the river, not a big wide mass other than first mile. So you know, everybody wants to be in the same spot, and they want to run nice and straight, but they don't necessarily run nice and straight. That's not true. I mean, that's not just OC6s, right? There's people in other kind of boats that have trouble keeping their thing running. They're just the consequences are minor when somebody goes sideways into you with their 12-6 paddleboard versus 2,000 pounds plus of team haul and butt.
Yeah, the even the start line, like you said, it's huge. But the first thing that happens in like a half mile is there's a left-hand turn into the bend of the river, and then the current is pretty strong in the middle, right? So there's some paddlers that want to kind of cut that corner a little bit. There's other ones that are looking to get to the middle. Well, if you
Mm-hmm.
line up on the left side and you want to get to the middle, and somebody's in the middle trying to cut the corner, you're going to have these lines that are going to ultimately cross. And
Yeah.
with smaller boats, like you said, they're when they hit the generated force is minimal. You just kind of bounce off. Their ability to decelerate is much lower as well. The OC6 is really tricky because there's so much generated force, right? It's like a train going down, right? They see something on the rails, and when they lock up on the brakes, it takes over a mile to come
Yeah.
to a stop because it's so heavy, and they're not going that fast. It's not like a bullet train. We're just talking about like a 50,
Yeah.
mile per hour, but because it's millions of pounds. And I know with the OC6, that was one of the criticisms, like, why don't those boats just stop? Like, if you try to stick your blade in the water to stop the thing, one, you're endangering your paddling for your shoulders, elbows, if
Oh
you
yeah.
twist your back, right?
Yep.
And it won't slow down. So if you're listening to the podcast and you don't understand the OC6 and how it functions, take whatever vessel you paddle, get it to sprinting speed, and then stop it. Do whatever you have to
Mhm.
with your paddle and slow it down, and try to account for how long that takes, and now multiply it essentially by 6, and you get a feel for a
Yeah.
boat that's at speed and your whole crew in unison trying to slow the sucker down, right? And it just,
Yeah.
and it ends up being like a freight train, wrecking ball. Like you said with No Good Solution, in years past with less boats, part of the fun is putting them with the other boats. That way they're racing somewhere, right?
Mhm.
But I think now if it's going to consistently have 25 or 30 other boats in that category, having its own wave is enticing because those are the people you're racing. You're going to be right
Right.
next to these other 30 giant boats. Clearwater Classic down here is a big one. The mixed race has 18 or 19 boats, and that is exhilarating, let alone having over 20. But like I said, the logistical hurdles of, do they go first? Do they go last? How do we
Mhm.
separate them? And I'm very interested to see how they solve it. And I really don't doubt that it will get solved. Like the event has done very well in kind of rolling with the punches over time. And this is just one more logistical hurdle that kind of captures the rest of the paddling community. Because I don't think dragon boats are going to get into it, fortunately, so we don't have to worry about like 50 of them
Right.
lining up for 30 miles of paddling on the same side. So I think this kind of like finishes the paradigm. If they can figure this out, it opens up new doors forever
Mhm.
with the team paddling. So, have you ever been into sup? For some reason, I thought you were like a sup racer at some point. Have you like dodged that bullet each time
I,
it come
I,
up?
I pretty much have dodged that bullet. I had a very I bought a used paddle board at one time, and this thing was awesome. It was the strangest board, and I still have never seen another one. It was a Jimmy Sticks woodpecker. Had a laminated hardwood floor looking deck. Um, it was it had a V the entire length of the boat, almost like a racing canoe, but it was extremely wide. It was like I think it was 28 or 30 inches wide. It looked like a rec board, but it was super unstable for how wide it was because you really were on this V. Um, and for its width, it was really fast. And it was only a 12'6" board. This crazy wide 12'6" board had enough volume for somebody my weight because it was so wide, but it also was on this V. So it was really squirrely. You get it in rough water, it was crazy squirrely. Nothing at all like anything else I've paddled, since on a board. And I paddled that thing for a year or two. I just did a couple little races locally. Um, Nothing. I'd never traveled to race, so
The first thing that comes to mind that's just like that, going back to marathon canoe, is the Savage River John Diller shape.
yeah.
Their unlimited 17.6 is like their. I think they just took the bottom of their marathon canoe and was like,
Yeah.
hey, let's put like a flat deck on it. And you're right, it's so funny that those boards that are shaped like that are super wide, but they feel immensely tippy, and it shows you how important the underside of the board is, kind of despite the width. Like there are
Yeah.
things that you can shape that make a 26-inch wide board the fastest as well as the tippiest, right?
Yeah.
And it just kind of, shows that evolution over time has been interesting. So speaking of that, from your perspective, from the outside looking in, watching sup grow and balloon in popularity and then the balloon shrinking a little bit, how do you feel that has changed the community over time for better or for worse?
It's changed it mostly for better. For one thing, it's grown the sport enormously. Um, a lot of a lot, SUP brought people in to the sport desperately needed in paddle sports in general. they have then those folks have since branched into the other disciplines. Not as much surf ski, but some surf ski. A lot of them have gone into outrigger. Um, the sport keeps growing. I think the popularity of Chattajack getting bigger every year is evidence. Now the mix of craft are changing, but the popularity keeps growing. The number of races keep growing. I just saw a recent thread about, why are we having so many good races on the same weekend, right? And instead of complaining about that, we should be celebrating that or rejoicing that there's this embarrassment of riches now with paddle races. 15 years ago, there was hardly anything, and you had to travel a long ways, and it wasn't a very big race, and it wasn't really barely worth it because you didn't know who was going to show up. It was just a smattering. You might show up and just a bunch of folks with camping canoes just doing and you might show up and guys were showing up who were training for the Olympic team. You had no idea. Now it's very predictable. There's the classes are well defined now. There's just tons of races, and every kind of race you can kind of think of. At this point, you can go race in the Bayou down in Louisiana. They have a ton of races in that region. By the way, I've only done one over there, but it was one of the most fun races ever. That culture is insane. They're so fun, and their after parties. The food, you'll never eat better food at an after party for a paddling event. So yeah, there's so much more racing, so many more types of boats. There's, when I started paddling, the Futuro was exciting because it had adjustable footboards, right? I flew to Australia to visit a friend of mine and did a little local race while I was there, and I had to borrow a boat, and everybody had glassed in footwell lengths. That was just the boat was built for you. The only time you could sell or trade the boat is if you found somebody your size. So we're super lucky. There's just so many different types of boats now. People talk about the outriggers. There's so many. There's an outrigger out there for you, for your body type, for the type of water you paddle, for your general fit and finish, and what makes you comfortable, what doesn't. It's out there. Skis are the same way. They're so much better than they were 15, 20 years ago. They're just so much more comfortable. They can do more with shorter water lines than they were. So yeah, the sport's growing. I think outrigger certainly is outpacing everything else. SUP is taking the hit on that, but overall, I think SUP's probably still growing. I don't know for sure the numbers, but probably just because of the overall pie is getting bigger. So the size of that slice looks like it might be smaller, but the total amount of people in that slice is getting bigger.
Yeah, it's nice to look at it that you have like feast or famine, and there's always negatives with both and positives with both. But you're right. Like it's having a bunch of races on the same day is definitely better than having no races at all, right?
Right.
And kind of navigating that isn't so much a negative, but trying to pivot it into a larger positive, right? The SUP bubble essentially, right, brought in a ton of people, right? Big invention, for most consumers. Wow, this is amazing. Gets a lot of people into the sport. As that has diminished, right? There hasn't been an equivalent feeder system as big as SUP, because I think even with Dragon Boat, I don't think it's quite as large as what SUP did for the community at large. Do you ever feel like there's going to be something else like SUP that brings in a bunch of normal people, and then they eventually become super racers, or do you think that that wave was kind of a one and a done scenario?
I think SUP per se is probably one and done. There will be things that pop up. What they are, I can't really predict. I'm not much of a futurist, unfortunately. I'm the guy who thought Red Bull and bottled water wouldn't sell. So, if I saw a trend coming out right now, I think the whole concept of pedaled craft is really intriguing and could bring in a lot of people if that sport was a little more well defined, and you had some common sense racing craft in that, and you had divisions for that could possibly bring people into it. especially from cycling in general. As the roads and the highways get more dangerous to ride a road bike, and land use issues start getting more difficult for mountain biking, you could see that kind of thing. I think when I started, it was marathon canoeing, right? It was huge in the Northeast. I mean, absolutely enormous. And you'd go to races, and there'd be like Chattajack like starts, just volumes and volumes of boats on these lakes that went from shore to shore for start lines. General Clinton is like that, and it's still like that. But that's a regional thing. It didn't spread into the rest of the country. So can something like that spread into that country, into the rest of the country? Can like somebody like Nevin Harrison winning gold medal on the Olympics, is that triggering more in the sprint field? Can sprint kick off more clubs in this country as a result of the increased paddling? I think that's already happened, but I'm not sure. I'm not in that community, never have been. And Joe's point in his podcast was, sprint is great for bringing kids in because it's not super long, it's not super difficult. And I think that's the growth is just trying to get some kind of programs into schools that get kids on the water, compete with the rowing. Rowing is expensive because you have to have these massive boats, and you have to have coaches, and they have to have motor boats to go along and coach with them from the shore. So you only see it at college prep schools, and in general, it's not something that's in every daily high school. Whereas paddling with canoes, outriggers, that sort of thing could be driven into the schools. And I think that's where a good opportunity lies. It's just who's got the good ideas to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a great insight with the pedal ski or the pedal driven crafts, right? Because we have a couple of like pedal style surf skis, which are kind of the culmination of what would a pedal boat in a racing field similar to what we're doing end up
Mm-hmm.
looking like. Future podcast guys, Jerry Wolf, who at kind of leading that
Yeah.
configuration of the boats, and then John Radford is the other one who's in town right now. And you're right, like that's a great segue for the cyclist. And you're right, like you see it all the time. Like there's a lot of cross training paddlers that cycle, and that results in fatalities. Like I can think of 4 or 5 people here in Florida that have
Yeah.
died on roadways, cross training for paddle, which is very unfortunate. But having that outlet on the water, you're right, that kind of opens the door for more things with the right structure. So that is about it for the podcast. Is there anything you would like to say to the Paddle Pursuit viewers, people, friends, and family that are watching you and have made it this far? What are your final thoughts?
Just if you want the sport to grow, to the people listening, if you want the sport to grow, get out there and do it. There's nothing that makes the sport grow better than people showing up at races and buying the equipment, which allow the manufacturers, the people making outriggers, making skis, making sups, they can dump money back in. If they're selling product, they can dump money back into races. More people can come in, or just do the sport, get out there, and don't do 1 or 2 a year. Try to get out there for 4, 5, 6, 7 races a year, and just get out there, and you don't have to be in peak shape for every race, but try to get a race you want and go after it. And drag some kids into the sport. That's if we don't have the kids, we'll see it all go away very gradually as people get older.
Awesome, Theo. Thank you so much to all of our viewers for tuning into the Paddle Pursuit. We'll see you guys next Monday with our next video. And thank you again, Theo.
All right. Thanks for having me.